Long Island.
And good evening, I'm Jackie Lucas.
And I'm Drew Scott. We begin tonight with a developing situation in Gaza. A ceasefire underway today after nearly 3 weeks of fighting between Israel and Hamas.
This weekend's stall in fighting is the product of non-stop negotiations brokered by Secretary of State John Kerry. And tonight, Seaford Congressman Peter King is opening up about the situation and Kerry's mission to control it.
News 12 Long Island's Amy McGorry spoke with him earlier this afternoon. Amy?
Drew, while all eyes were watching this temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hamas today, Congressman King told me the fighting has been going on for so long that the U.S. needs to help find a permanent solution.
I'm not even certain the ceasefire is important right now.
Seaford Congressman Peter King says although a 12-hour ceasefire was observed today between Israel and Hamas, it is not a positive sign that international efforts to broker a deal can be made to end the nearly 3 weeks of fighting.
A ceasefire, it serves a short-term humanitarian purpose, but it's only important in the long run if there's going to be an assurance or any kind of an agreement that Hamas is going to destroy its tunnels.
King says the ceasefire could actually be detrimental to Israel.
If Hamas is just going to use the time of the ceasefire to consolidate its position, then to me it hurts Israel. Israel is not in there just fighting for the sake of fighting. They want to destroy the tunnels. And the longer the ceasefire is, the more difficult it becomes for Israel to maintain its momentum.
After efforts by U.S. Secretary John Kerry for a longer ceasefire were originally rejected, Israel agreed to a 12-hour period that went into effect today. Late Saturday afternoon, Hamas rejected Israel's request to extend it. Today, as fighting stalled, Secretary Kerry met with his international counterparts in Paris with the goal of finding a way to get both sides of this conflict to agree to a more permanent ceasefire. Congressman King hopes Kerry's efforts will be successful on all fronts.
I think if the ceasefire is tied to a real agreement, and that to me has to involve the destruction of the tunnels, because if there's a ceasefire and everyone goes back to where they were before, Hamas still has those tunnels to attack Israel from. We're just putting off the fight for another day.
We did receive reports that shortly after the ceasefire deadline, Hamas did fire rockets towards Israel. We'll, of course, follow these developments throughout the night. Drew?
Amy, thanks very much. In Manhattan today, over 1,000 protesters took to the streets denouncing the deadly violence in the Gaza Strip. Although peaceful, the group took over Times Square and later went on to march through Midtown chanting Free Palestine. Many of the demonstrators were Palestinian or have family and friends living inside the war zone. Now, we are following a situation in Libya tonight. The State Department has evacuated our embassy in Tripoli. American staffers have been removed because clashes between the Libyan military and rival militias have intensified in that city. Secretary of State John Kerry says the embassy isn't permanently shutting down, but until the situation calms down, he says diplomatic activities will be suspended. Jackie?
The remains of more than 36 passengers aboard Malaysia Flight 17 have arrived in the Netherlands. 2 cargo planes delivered the bodies of 38 people who will now be examined at a forensic center. All on board were killed after that flight was shot down over eastern Ukraine this month. U.S. and Ukrainian officials believe it was shot down with a missile by pro-Russian separatists, likely by mistake. The missile believed to belong to Russia, and because of that, Seaford Congressman Peter King says President Vladimir Putin is ultimately responsible.
We already know that Russia and Putin provided the separatists with the weapons, with these rockets who could bring down planes at 40, 50,000 feet. So Putin is ultimately responsible for the taking down of the Malaysian airliner.
Meanwhile, the Dutch government tonight says it has begun to identify the first of the 298 victims.